Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn blog, and we're going to be covering some ideas of critical thinking by speculative non-Buddhist philosopher and critic of Western Romanticism and capitalism, H. Tom Pepper. Tom Pepper is a guy I don't know super well, but I've been reading him for about a decade. Off and on. I was recently reminded of his existence by a listener who got me going back and looking at the speculative non-Buddhism, ex-Buddhism world that includes people like Gwen Wallace, highly influenced by Laurel, the Imperfect Buddha podcast host, I believe M. Connolly, more inspired by Marx, and then Tom Pepper himself, who's inspired by Marx and Althusser and Badiou, etc. And we talked a lot about critical thinking in an interview I did with Tom in response to that. And this is going to be recorded soon after I did that interview. I don't know if it's going to be released in proximity to that interview. But I wanted to talk about Hume because Hume is in some ways the air that we breathe, just like most philosophy, both continental and analytic, is in response to the early phases of German idealism and Western culture. And in some ways, if philosophy is a footnote to Hegel, modern philosophy is a rejoinder paper to Hegel. Actually, I said that wrong. If philosophy is a footnote to Plato, then modern philosophy is a rejoinder paper to Hegel. There we go. But Hume is the water of which most of us breathe. It's Hume and Kant are the kinds of starting points where analytic philosophy really starts to rebuild, either in neo-Kantianism, which is still German idealist, or in the corresponding developments out of what we might call late British empiricism. And this is on a topic that is dear to my heart, which is justice, a term that I hate. Why is it dear to my heart? Because I think justice is trying to get at something that I think super important. I often talk about virtue ethics and not just political ethics, but interpersonal social ethics. But I also find justice to be one of the vaguest concepts ever that we throw around as an abstraction. And so dealing with someone deconstructing and reconstructing what Hume is doing with it, because that is one of the things that affects so much of modern thought, is a place for us to start to pick apart these ideas. And this is, I might write more on this and in response to Tom here, but I need to think about it first. So I've started Radical Engagements to kind of walk you guys through how I approach close reading. And particularly when I critically engage with a reading, I'm actually modeling it for you. Some people get frustrated with that. They want me to read the article and then summarize or do clips and all this. That's not why I ever went on this project. But this one's even more interesting because I'm actually walking you through the thought process I have when I'm about to write in response to somebody else. This is like how I think about responding. All right. This is not, if I was going to form a response, I'd write this out, but I would actually probably take a notebook and jot down like this as I was reading, and then sort the notebook out and piece it apart and then go and talk to someone about it, and then maybe sleep on it a day and then start writing and see what happened. And I'd probably throw 5 drafts away after that point. But this is why I operate this way. So let's get into it. Let's start with Human Justice Part 1. And I'll make it bigger so you can see it. This is Tom Pepper. Human Justice Part 1. Hume defines justice as the respect and protection of private property. Fundamental bourgeois assumption, right? And we have to immediately realize that if you're starting with Hume, you are starting with this as the primary basis of justice. So critiques of private property, critiques of bourgeois society would be necessarily unjust by Hume. and tells us the sole foundation is the usefulness of the contents of society. Now, notice that society and private property are almost equivocal in this. There is, he is sure, no instinct or natural sentiment of justice, so it must be learned. My interest in this particular section is how much we have all followed suit, assuming the concept of justice ought to be limited to preserving the current form of society, as justice is actually about the maintenance of law and thus the maintenance of a status quo. And you even see this in the way people could treat Trump today, as if the status quo is good. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump breaking up the status quo is good or revolutionary. Neither one of those things are necessarily implied by something bad being broken up, but you have to critique it on some other grounds in protection of the status quo, unless you can also justify the status quo itself, which, of course, many politicos, including many liberal Democrats, cannot really do. In fact, they're in this dual position of constantly critiquing the status quo while also maintaining it. But anyway, back to this. And so necessarily to the protection of private property, as private property is the basis of the extension of our current society. As with all of Hume and all of capitalist ideology generally, this section is an overwhelmingly pile of poor arguments and unexamined assumptions. Yeah, I see that a lot. Even with writers I love, like William Bowman, I see all kinds of understanding assumption in the definitions used to be done to set up a non-biased framework or calculus. This is one of the things I talk about. While you can't say norms and descriptions are the same, are ises or oughts, you also can't say that they're totally separate, because the categories we use to describe the is implies oughts. Sorry, Hume. That's another debunking of Hume. But also, not so going so far to say that the is does imply the ought. I actually think the natural fallacy is a fallacy. So there's a bunch of things you have to parse there. All right. I'm going to split the discussion of justice into two posts, one on each part. And in fact, I'm going to focus for the first part on just one paragraph 18 of the section, because I think this is both the most shocking claim when stated so bluntly, but it is also an assumption that underlies all current common sense ethics, as well as the two dominant forms of academic ethics, which, by the way, is why I rely on virtue ethics so much, is because it does not assume property is part of the calculus in the same way as deontology and utilitarianism do, for obvious reasons. AKA, while they exist in a time where there is a nascent concept of property, our current concept of property didn't apply yet in ancient virtue ethics. All right, here it is. Quote, were there a species of creatures intermingled with men, which, though rational, were possessed of such inferior strength, both of body and mind, that they were incapable of all resistance and could never, upon the highest provocation, make us feel the effects of their resentment? The necessary consequence, I think, is that we should be bound by the laws of humanity to give gentle usage to these creatures, but should not, properly speaking, lie under any restraint of justice with regards to them. Nor could they possess any right or property exclusive of such arbitrary lords. I actually think this hypothetical is actually a shade hypothetical about colonialism, but I'll come back. All right. Our intercourse with them could not be called society, which supposes a degree of equality, but the absolute command on one side, servile obedience on the other. Whatever we covet, they must instantly resign. Our permission is only tenure by which they hold their possessions. Our compassion and kindness is only check by which they curb our lawless will. And as to no inconvenience ever results from the exercise of power so firmly established in nature, their strain of justice and property being totally useless, would never have a place in so unequal a confederacy. What strikes me as startling here is the ease in which the laws of humanity can be thoroughly separated out from the entire category of justice. Though he isn't explicit about what these laws might be, he puts them in a separate category from justice, is what makes the rest of the argument concerning justice seem plausible. This section rehearses the standard myth of scarcity, which underlies all capitalist ideologies, aka the reason why we do stuff is there's a lack of abundance, and so we have to use markets and privatization as a means of epistemologically justifying the allocation of resources under scarce conditions. Anyway, just explaining you the logic here. Hume creates an absurd extreme of a world of abundance, then an alternate extreme of scarcity in order to imply that somehow we live provides the right level of scarcity to suit the present disposition of the human heart. That is, that there is such a scarcity that we devolve into brutal Hobbesian savagery, nor an abundance which we could survive if we had a mind replete with friendship and generosity. Instead, we live in a state in which those who are sufficiently industrious and self-interested will have enough, and those who are lazy will be strong enough to seriously threaten their claim to the ownership of natural resources. Thus, justice is useful because it reproduces the current state of society, in which those whose ancestors claimed ownership of natural resources will continue to inherit them, and all feelings of humanity are naturally confined to the family, aka you only have equal relations within the family because the family is truly equal to you. Which in and of itself is a big fucking question because the families actually do not tend to operate under assumptions of equality. But anyway, particularly between parents and children, but even between, say, male and female partners. The casual sliding between terms from mind to heart, from nature to social state of mankind, enable creation of this myth of sufficiency, where there's naturally just enough to support the current social formation and to allow those who are industrious and sufficiently conscious about both the disguised self-interestedness of men with the idealism of imprudent fanatics to live comfortably. Just checking up that. Whatever then they choose to have compassion to those who are incapable of all resistance is not a matter of justice at all. These assumptions underlie all political and economic discourses today. We never consider the actual source of all wealth as creation of a class of people who are in fact incapable of all resistance and could never, upon highest provocation, make us feel the effects of their resentment. That is, money becomes meaningless unless there is a class of powerless people deprived of all necessities of life who are obliged to do what the wealthy and powerful demand of them. That creation and reproduction of such a class of people is the work of the state should be obvious given the current political situation. What remains obscure ever since Hume is the nature of wealth. That it is not the property of a person, but completely a relation between people, specifically a relation of power over few over the many. Their right to exercise this power is what is meant by justice. That exercise of the laws of humanity remain completely optional and never seem to trouble us. That those born without private property have a right to live on earth seems, in the discourse of political economy, an absurd claim. Sick, by the way. They exist only out of the compassion of the powerful who deign to allow us to serve as wage slaves, even though they couldn't maintain their power without it. But that's neither here nor there. And in Hume's view, anyway. We are not permitted to consider whether the state of affairs is just once justice becomes a protection of private property and excludes all considerations of friendship, compassion, of the best possible social formation, which is actually fundamentally different than ancient philosophy, and it's something I like to point out about Hume. I would suggest that this assumed separation of justice and humanity is so common today that almost no one sees it as a problem. We cannot consider the possibility that justice might mean something like determining what kind of social formation would be best to enable all humans to flourish. Instead, we seek a combination of power and luxury for the few and bare survival for the West and call it fairness. I mean, after all, someone had to enclose the commons and appoint a king for all this stuff to start in the first place. Our inability to see humanity as an essential part of any just social formation is, well, necessary to capitalism, and why capitalism became the only game on earth, fascism was inevitable. So socialism is inevitable, though. I actually think, like, we are the Waluigi to capitalism's Luigi. As much as fascism is. And fascism is also the Wario to our Mario. Sorry, I wish I could exclude fascism as a crisis of both capitalism and socialism, but socialism is already a response to the crisis of capitalism. So pretending that fascism is also the response to the crisis of capitalism and somehow fundamentally separate from socialism seems to miss the point. But all these are being discussed at such high level of abstraction that it's not easy to really parse what we mean here. So let's go back. To escape this, we need at the very least to see the flourishing that does not mean owning a mansion and a yacht and having power over millions of others, that one can achieve these things and be a terrible example of a human being. Flourishing can only come to mean developing our full potential as humans once we stop separating out humanity from justice. But what does this mean exactly? I'm not sure I know. So that's point one. And I'm not sure we can separate humanity from justice, but maybe for different reasons than Tom here. Although I agree with what a lot of Tom says about the underlying assumptions of capitalism and their problematics, and that this is just assumed to court and in Hume. But I'm not sure that we could say that justice is anything outside of a human construct, and its reality is based on human intersubjective judgment anyway. Otherwise, I'm talking about justice in the forms of particular abstractions or particular virtues. I can talk about being just in the context of specific virtues because those virtues delimit what we can mean by justice. Now, this is fundamentally separate from utilitarianism and deontology, both of whom are the primary academic modes of ethics and capital, but nonetheless. Let's see, though, maybe this gets more clarified in Tom's second piece on the subject. I'm really enjoying Tom's approach here, and I want to be fair. Human Justice, Part 2. In the beginning of this section, Hume makes a statement that is probably not shocking to most readers, but ought to be. He claims that if we examine the particular laws of a society, we will find that the only object of all laws is the good of mankind. Yeah, that's horseshit on its face. Sorry. Sorry, I've been with Tom. That's just that people want to believe that is so transparently false. All right. Of course, he does not do such examining. In fact, he mentions no particular law at all. But the matter is not settled, and we are required to accept the assumption that if we ever did, this examination would certainly find the laws regarding private property serve the interests of society. It is certainly possible to examine the laws of our society, though, and to see that our own laws, in fact, serve only the interests of those who make them, the wealthiest 10% or so of the country. This finding is avoided by simply making an assertion of what would happen if we did the examination and then never actually doing it. We see this strategy today quite often in political and economic discourses, not to mention the discourse of psychology, education, medicine, literature, etc. Hume then proceeds to argue that it is not possible to distribute wealth according to virtue or merit, which makes Republican meritocracy, but still cites Hume, really funny. But because humans are naturally prone to self-conceit. In any way, merit is naturally obscure. I actually agree. Merit is naturally obscure, but that's neither here nor there. Leaving us unable to detect it. Well, no, because merit is naturally obscure because merit is presented as such an abstract that we can't define it. Merit as to what? All right. But anyway. He does admit that the myth of scarcity on which neoliberal ideologies depend is in fact false. Asterisk. I agree that neoliberal ideologies depending on it is true, but I would also say we are often equating neoliberalism to capitalism, and neoliberalism is a specific historical instance of capital. Subset C is not all the same as set A, even if subset C is always implied in set A. All right. That nature is so liberal that every individual could enjoy all necessities or even most of the comforts of life if we divided goods equally. In fact, in this same paragraph 25, he goes on to admit that, quote, wherever we depart from this equality, we rob the poor of more satisfaction than we add to the rich. Yeah, duh. But nonetheless, still, such an equal distribution is necessary because without it, you, quote, reduce society to the most extreme indigence. We would all be lazy without the constant threat of homelessness and starvation. So we ought to never provide the basic necessities to everyone. How Malthusian of you, except you've already admitted that Malthusianism is false, Hume. All right. Further, nobody would be industrious unless he knew his family would always inherit all the property he acquires, since it is essential for a good society that we not be a meritocracy at all. Rewarding virtue would lead to laziness, it seems. Yeah, take that, Aristotle. Quote, the rich must forever maintain the unequal distribution created by virtue of their ancestors. Currently, there is no consideration that this might lead to indigence. Exclamation point. All right. We see the crucial assumption made in passing in paragraphs 28 and 29 that all writers on the laws of nature arrive at the necessity of private property. No, they sure as fucking don't. They just do it in Europe in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, regardless of their particular systems. False. This is a form of universal assumption today that capitalism is the only natural form of human life and that all other forms are mere systems due to collapse. Although capitalism is also a system. And anyway, it literally, this is naturalizing sets of assumptions so you don't have to look at them. Only private property can encourage useful habits and accomplishments, but there is no exploration of what counts as useful. Are the intentions and supposed advances of the capitalist epoch really so useful? Were leaded gasoline and fluorocarbons useful to the good of humanity? Are social media and smartphones? I mean, even many Marxists don't question the latter. Anyway, we consider it more useful to give everyone the necessities and even the most comforts of life than it is to produce nuclear weapons or destroy the environment. But the implicit assumption so common today that it goes unnoticed in all economic discourse is that useful is equivalent to profitable. This is even true in pragmatic philosophy, actually. The cash value of truth. And I used to work with a pragmatist who was also a communist, and she would invoke this all the time. And I'd be like, that doesn't make any fucking sense for a communist to say. But anyway, and depends on inequity. We get the majority to suffer long hours of brutal manual labor for the benefit of the few, without seriously threat of starvation. Hume allows that capitalism is inherently Pareto inefficient, but simply assumes that this necessity to maximize innovation in industry was taken as unquestionable goods. When I mean innovation is, I think, is a good, but what we mean by it is always contextualized, right? There's never any examination of whether hard work and constant innovation are desirable. Well, constant innovation is not even possible. But anyway. And to this day, we would have a hard time convincing almost anyone that they aren't necessarily good for the happiness of the majority of humans. I don't know. I agree with you, Tom, that the economic discourse won't allow that. I do wonder if people are beginning to wonder about smartphones. All right. In the end, human assisted justice is in fact not a natural, but a learned sentiment. All right. Remember, moral sentiments of what Hume is talking about. And this was his answer to the fact that you can't deduce morality from pure abstract reason. In an interesting insight into the nature of ideology, he explains that, quote, the views most familiar to us are apt for that very reason to escape us, and we have very frequently performed from certain motives. We are apt likewise to continually mechanically, without recalling on every occasion, the reflections which first determined it. His argument is that justice appears to be a natural sentiment only because we have been so thoroughly trained in the kinds of behaviors from early childhood. I mean, that's hard to prove one way or the other. It's like trying to prove if language is learned or if there's an innate universal grammar. Good fucking luck. It is an interesting because he could not apply this insight to his own assumptions about the naturalness of private property, industry, and innovation. I mean, this is one of those things where you are admitting something that's damning other assumptions that you have, and you can't look at that. A long history of that in philosophy. For continuity, I'm going to turn to the next third. Some further considerations with regard to justice before proceeding to section 4 of a political society. I'm proceeding a bit slowly with this because I have in fact been making some progress on the novel I'm writing. I'm going to read this even though it's not relevant. I continue to be slow post here until the draft of the novel is done, which may take most of the summer. Nevertheless, I will carry to the end of the second inquiry towards justice. I find it simultaneously fascinating and troubling how many of our common forms of sophistry and our most deeply held felicitous arguments were already formalized in philosophy discourse almost 3 centuries ago. Take that, Hume. It is interesting how people will admit their blind spots, but not apply the admission of blind spots to their own ideological assumptions. Many such cases, as we might say on the internet. Now let's go on this next section. Some further considerations in regards to justice. In his attempt to give, quote, some more particular explication of the origins and nature of justice, he makes a few astounding assumptions. First, he assumes that The social virtues of humanity and benevolence, which he never does define, exert their influence by instinct, which actually doesn't make any sense considering that he sees them as relevant to justice, but not the same as justice because justice has to be learned. But benevolence and virtues of humanity, social virtues of humanity, are all asserted by instinct. Is justice not a social virtue? Apparently not. Okay, quote. Tom Pepper, then I'll quote. We are, quote, under the domination of the beneficence of the beneficent affections, excuse me. That's hard to say. Of the beneficent affections, controlled by them, while justice is an act of our rational will. Now, again, what I find fascinating is moral sentiments is because Hume has already problematized the idea that morality is from a rational will, but somehow justice is because reasons having to do with property. Further, it is inevitable, he tells us, that benevolence will, quote, often prescribe measures of conduct, which are very different from the strict rules of right and justice. Oddly, humanity and benevolence turn out to be implements to a just society rather than its goal. Now, that's interesting. Hume makes a startling claim that even God could not exclude all evil or inconveniences in life, so we certainly can't be expected to do better. Yet that is such a fallacious argument I can't see straight. You talk about putting the cart before the horse. If we tried to work towards perfect justice, then things would only be worse. But again, we don't know what justice is, except the implementation of will. But then if perfect justice is not that implementation, then it's the natural affections of beneficent will and social virtues of humanity, which are instinctual, but that's actually a problem for perfect justice. Yeah, you can see how we're beginning to turn ourselves in circles and spinning in a grave. The best we can do is to hope for laws which allow the balance of good to preponderate above that of evil. Of course, we can see this claim at all times in political discourse, that there is no alternative assertion, Tina, good old Tina, or the argument we can't relive the suffering of some or other group because the economy won't let us. Relieve the suffering of some or other group because the economy won't let us. Sorry about that. Sick. Finally, another assumption which ought to be troubling, but for most people they would not be, the inherent antagonism between private and public. Although I would actually say the public has subsumed the private in a big way, but nonetheless. The argument in the final paragraph of the above appendix is quite bizarre. Hume seems to be claiming that we only have private harm once we are general the rules of equity meant to stabilize society, as if, without the laws of private property, no person could ever be harmed in any way. The idea that there can be something which injures a community but does no harm to any individual is a bit difficult to imagine, except for the kind of mind which assumes the hypostaticization of things like the market and society and places their well-being above that of the individuals participating in them. The subsumption of the specific concrete to the general abstract. Anyway, today, we would no doubt assume that our private interests are always in conflict with the public good. We cannot comprehend things like universal free education, roads, healthcare, etc., are goods for each of us individually. I mean, I think some of us can comprehend it, but it's not generally assumed. Of course, this assumption follows from the participation in the capitalist economy. Typically, the capitalist will believe that he alone, by investing his money, has earned all wealth produced by his factory. He cannot imagine that workers contributed to the production of the project. They are only an unfortunate expense, kind of like a input. So he cannot imagine educating, housing, and providing healthcare for the workers in any way this a benefit to him. Actually, not sure that it was always true. It is true now. Right? Instead, it is a public good that is in competition with his private interest in accumulating wealth, even though it's necessary for his accumulating wealth, which is why in the past, capitalists even supported that. So in some ways, I would actually say we see a capitalist ideology from Hume extending to ways that are actually irrational, even by capitalist logistics. All right. Hume's understanding of justice ultimately depends on two troubling assumptions. One is that humanity and benevolence are impediments to justice. The other is that we ought to be concerned with a public wrong when it is conjoined with considerable private one. Unless it hurts profit, it is not a serious wrong, and so ought not to be considered an injustice. Ouch. Now, we can further go through some of Tom's own assumptions here, but I think the fundamental questions that he's asking are actually interesting. Like, why is the public-private distinction so important to Hume? Why is he trying to bracket out so many things from what is justice? Why is justice considered a matter of law and law really about a matter of private property? We see this even in like Madison's defense of minoritarianism, which liberals often invoke to defend, minorities in society, like racial minorities or religious minorities, etc., but was really about the defense of the prime minority, the rich, and their privilege and their property, even more than their privilege. Actually, privilege discourse is a little bit misleading here. There's lots to pick apart here, and Hume does seem to be, as Tom Pepper pointing out, one of the first instantiations of the special pleading writ large in our general society. And it's based on positing distinctions that he can't even truly justify, but just assert. So when I complain that people today can't actually make an argument, maybe I should complain that people have never been able to make an argument. I actually don't think it's true. I do think it's worse, but still, maybe it was never as strong as we would hope. And on that, protect your peace. Go read Tom Pepper stuff. Take care.